My name is Jim Bodington. I'm a student at the University of New Mexico in the Department of Philosophy. I work primarily in contemporary continental thought, which is a change of pace from some of what we've been talking about thus far. So I'm going to try to contextualize in this presentation and situate certain of these topics of discussion and debate. So what my paper is doing, the paper from which this presentation is derived, is looking at the challenge to the identity and coextension of personhood and humanness, and the consequential challenge to the exclusion of animals from the sphere of moral consideration from two different perspectives, namely Singerian applied ethics and Derridian deconstruction. And from there, what I'm attempting to do is to see how this collapse of the person-human identity forces us to rethink philosophy in two different registers, an ontology and an ethics, at a descriptive and a prescriptive level. And I'm going to close by nominating feminist care ethics as a possible framework from which to think newly about the nature of our relationship and obligation to non-human animals. So, it is my contention that philosophy now, as a discipline, this is, a metaphilosophical point that I'm making in this presentation, philosophy must reckon with the revolutionary uncoupling of humanity and personhood. And here I'm extending Singer's insights, in practical ethics and later works. No longer can it be taken for granted, I'd suggest, that these two categories are identical or even coextensive. Effective critical challenges to human exceptionalism and the exploitation of animals, both philosophical and practical, and as an instance of philosophical and practical exploitation of animals in a single go, I'm going to talk about Descartes a bit. These critical challenges have identified the groundless exclusion of non-human animals from the sphere of consideration, moral and otherwise. And what I find interesting and what I hope to bring to light here is that such challenges have come from philosophical figures and schools that are not often thought together. For instance, deconstruction, Singer's applied ethics, particularly his preference utilitarianism, the specifics of which I'll be bracketing for the purposes of this presentation, and care ethics, a movement that originated in feminist moral psychology in the late 1960s. What these challenges share, besides occasional elements, is a connection, I would suggest, to a sort of post-death of God ethics coming out of the work of Nietzsche, and offer a potential for radically rethinking our relationships to animals in multiple registers. So what the decoupling of humanity and personhood on two fronts in Derridian deconstruction as well as in the work of Peter Singer has amounted to among other things, it's certainly a polysemic development in ethical thought. One of the things that has amounted to is a deep challenge to human exceptionalism. So the next step following this challenge, I think, is to think through the remnants of exceptionalism at the heart of thinking about morals. If we can draw the comparison to Nietzsche, for those that are familiar with the madman parable in The Gay Science, it has been announced that God is dead, but we are still struggling with his ghost in the marketplace of ideas. I would suggest that what needs to be done is to give up the ghost of human exceptionalism along with it. So my question is, how are we to formulate a philosophical groundwork for thinking about ourselves and animals in the light of these developments that is compelling both descriptively and prescriptively? More or less, I think that we ought to purge philosophy of this insistence on the special status of the human, an insistence which turns out to have no more argumentative basis than the claim that such a status is divinely granted. Such a philosophical purging will do two things. First, it'll clear the ground for a more rigorous thinking of rights, and second, we'll do more, I'm going to argue, to speak to our intuitions with regard to alleviating the suffering of sentient beings rather than justifying such suffering. So what I think is being called for, and I'm going to offer a very modest proposal, is a non-speciesist ontology and ethics. So the motivation for thinking at a metaphilosophical level is a commitment to the idea that philosophical exclusion has a practical implication. Philosophical exclusion, I think, of animals is tied up with an exclusion from the circle of our obligation, and is an exclusion that leads us to think of animal suffering as less important than human suffering. The only corrective I'm going to suggest, offering an account that in some ways runs deeper than preference utilitarianism, the only corrective may not be to rationally imagine and postulate what the preference of animal others may be, which I think may still put us in a position of exceptionalism, but rather to attune ourselves and respond to the clear suffering and needs of those animals to whom we are connected, and to acknowledge that this connection is wider than we tend to think. So it's my contention, drawing from certain of Singer's points at the end of his rightfully well-known essay, All Animals Are Equal, as well as from contemporary deconstructivist and feminist thinker Kelly Oliver, who I will talk about, that over the course of Western philosophy, the animal, as the non-human, has often occupied a negative space. The animal has functioned as the foil against which the human is defined, and as has been said elsewhere, this is nowhere more clear than in Aristotle. The human is defined against the animal as rights bearer, rights granter, and worthy of moral consideration. In much of modern philosophy from the Enlightenment onward, in an attempt to overcome this attachment to the divinely granted special status of the human, there has been an emphasis on personhood. But nonetheless, that notion has too often been thought of, at least until the last few decades, has too often been thought of as coextensive and or identical with humanity or humanness, and has carried over much of the metaphysical baggage from that initial divine grant or imperative, which the Christian thinkers drew out of Aristotle and the legacy of Genesis. So thinking about Descartes as sort of a pivotal figure, literally pivotal, well, not literally pivotal, but pivotal in a number of senses. Literally pivotal would be strange. So his philosophical starting point, and here I want to draw some attention to the deep connection between animal exploitation and use at a philosophical level and a practical level. His philosophical starting point, his ontology, which was rooted in a general skepticism of the other and an exclusion of the animal as the unreasonable, resulted in counterintuitive consequences, namely that animals were automata and that their screams of pain, when subjected to the experiments of him and his students, were simply the sounds of a machine malfunctioning. It's a bit anachronistic, but I would like to think that such an insistence ought to serve as something as an auto-reductio of his starting premises, if they did follow deductively. I guess for time I will skip mention of Judith Butler. We can talk about that later if you're interested. So the challenge, I think, to human exceptionalism is really explodes onto the philosophical scene with Friedrich Nietzsche's Death of God, as articulated in The Gay Science and elsewhere. What Nietzsche means by the death of God, as needs to be carefully thought, is it's not necessarily an exhortation to atheism, as it is often taken to be. It is rather a comment on the fact that our ultimate explanatory bedrock has vanished. He says that the earth has been unchained from the sun. He blames or praises Kant for this. But what it means is there is no longer a final bedrock of appeal for our moral intuitions. That has vanished, and it appears now as having been taken for granted and ultimately contingent. counts as worthy of moral consideration becomes up to us. It becomes a contingency and a convention rather than set in stone. So having yanked away the metaphysical rug which served as the bedrock for human exceptionalism, it becomes important to recognize and correct the animal exclusion, which now shows up as not necessary, that has been at the root of moral philosophy and rights discourse. So what I hope to have conveyed here is that philosophy has traditionally excluded from the sphere of consideration the animal. And this is something that is not defensible argumentatively, and after Nietzsche we can see that the metaphysical rug has been pulled away and that the basis of human exceptionalism is ripe for collapse. So for the second part of this project, I'm looking at three important challenges, all of which, whether genealogically or not, I think have some deep connection to the Nietzschean dismantling of traditional ethics. Three important challenges to the philosophical exploitation of non-human animals that have arisen in the past few decades. First is Peter Singer's preference utilitarianism. The second is contemporary care ethics. And the third is the deconstructionist engagement with animal exclusion and human exception. So, regarding Peter Singer, I think that there are four insights that we can find. Here I'm drawing primarily on the essay, All Animals Are Equal. There are four insights that follow from the collapse of the metaphysical distinction between the human and the animal. This distinction which reserves personhood for the latter and bestows it with dominion, license, and moral superiority. And here I'm bracketing preference utilitarianism as a specific ethical framework for now. Rather, what I think are Singer's contributions in that essay, apart from outlining preference utilitarianism, are they are these 4 points which follow from a thoughtful engagement with the realization that we can no longer take for granted that we have been bestowed a special status. For instance, the principle of equality falls by the wayside. He brings to light suffering as a locus of ethical obligation rather than something which we can explain away, as in Descartes. It becomes clear that our attitude of commodification and domination over animals is problematic. And it becomes clear that speciesism is operative in philosophy both historically and, he would say, contemporarily, which I think is right. In a similar vein, but in a much different philosophical school, is a Derridian project of deconstruction, as it's taken up by contemporary scholar Kelly Oliver, who is in the Department of Philosophy at Vanderbilt. In her book entitled Animal Lessons, How They Teach Us to Be Human, she, following Singer, her relationship to Singer is ambivalent, but she takes these insights as trenchant. She argues that the line between the human and the animal is ultimately untenable. It's a classic deconstructionist move. Wherever we place the line will not render the line solid. And she says that the philosophical use of animals is twofold and pervasive. Animals serve a dual purpose in the history of philosophy, at least in philosophical thinking about human nature. The first is to borrow a phrase from Dr. Hopkins, to mark the sort of out-group in relationship to which we are an in-group. They always form the other to our circumscribed circle of rights havers. And she says this is, interestingly, tied up with the, many of our claims, many of our taken for granted claims about human nature over the course of history of philosophy derive from observations about animal behavior. So there is a twofold use of animals, both theoretical and practical, we might say. And she says the fact, as Singer shows, that the arguments offered in favor of the exclusion of animals from the moral sphere, the fact that they are so fallible for the most part, at least the ones that Singer brings to light, serves to reveal that there is a constitutive role that animal exploitation has played in the history of philosophy. We are so married, she says, to these problematic ideas about human superiority that it reveals a deeply entrenched problematic attitude. She says, coming out of this in a challenge to Singer, she says that rights discourse itself needs to be radically rethought following this explosion of the animal-human dichotomy. And she thinks through the ethical implications of this, which I'll just say a bit about. For Kelly Oliver's deconstructionist project, exclusion is at the very root of thinking about humanness and subjectivity and thus rights. And hers is a questioning that opens up a new set of questions. Rather than proposing that we ascribe rights to animals, says that it is high time to rethink the project of rights altogether. So with the last minute, let me draw some connections to contemporary care ethics. The second quote from Oliver's book here, rather than assert our domination over the earth and its creatures, this ethics, the deconstructionist ethics, obliges us to acknowledge our dependence upon them. It requires us to attend to our responsibility by virtue of that dependence. And what I go on to say, this will come up in the Q&A, is that the framework of care ethics with which hopefully some are familiar, I'm going to take for granted some degree of familiarity, the framework of care ethics offers a relational ontology which overcomes certain of the problematic elements of a more Cartesian ontology of autonomy, and it offers a way of thinking prescriptively about a relationship to animals, capturing something of this imperative to responsibility and caretaking that Oliver says. Now, care ethics that Oliver alludes to. Now, care ethics insists that our ethical obligations belong to those within the sphere of concern. And I will argue, or I would argue, that after Singer and these deconstructionist moves, it's no longer tenable to exclude animals from that sphere of concern. That those that are, under our domination by means of our displacement for housing, our farming for food, etc., 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 become subjects and subjects within our sphere and objects of our care and concern. So that was ill-paced, I apologize, but we can continue talking about it. Thank you. Yes.